Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here are your co-hosts, Doug Lesmerises and Shehan Jeyarajah. And we're back on the College Football Survivor Show. And Shehan, we're doing something we've never done before on this podcast, which makes me super eager to do this. We are rewatching and talking about a game from the past, but we are doing so to inform ourselves about the present in college football. And I think you could argue, Shehan, that you and I rewatched the most significant college football game as it affects now of the past 10 years. And we are talking about the college football playoff semifinal between the Georgia Bulldogs and the Oklahoma Sooners at the end of the 2017 season. It's in the Rose Bowl, the start of 2018. It is Kirby Smart in year 2 at Georgia, and it is Lincoln Riley in year 1 at Oklahoma, Shehan. And this is why we are doing it, because we are setting up another conversation on another podcast. But when you think about where Kirby Smart and Lincoln Riley are right now in the fabric of college football as we head towards a new era, this is like watching them toddle down the street together. This is like the first day of kindergarten. They are so new at this. But man, was it interesting to watch these two guys go at it.
Yeah, like you said, year 1 Lincoln Riley versus year 2 Kirby Smart. They very much don't have the rosters that they hope to have at later points. They both kind of are like at the beginning of their schematic strategy, I guess you could say. It was such a strange game to go back and watch. And obviously, so many names that maybe we've forgotten over the years, so many people who are on the sideline maybe who we might have a chance to talk about. It didn't feel like it's been that long. And also, by the way, again, we'll get much deeper into this. Like the inevitability and quality of these two teams, who I think both could have won the national championship if some things go right, versus some of the it just helps you contextualize in some ways the super teams that we have today that are inevitable. I don't think that either of these teams were just teams that were incapable of losing like we maybe have right now. And so it in a funny way, it made me harken back to a simpler time in college football, even though it was only 5 years ago. But it was a really, really interesting thought exercise.
It's so fascinating because this is the afternoon game. This is the 2-3 semifinal.
Yeah.
It's the undercard, and it is the future of college football. And the nightcap, the main event, is Dabo Swinney versus Nick Saban in a semifinal where Clemson is number 1 with Kelly Bryant. It's not the real Clemson. Alabama is number 4. They barely got in. Alabama is going to beat Clemson in that game, but the Clemson's going to come back the next year with Trevor Lawrence. But we know what Alabama and Saban have been. And during this game, Shehan, they go to like a cut, like, oh, coming up next. And they show Dabo Swinney and Nick Saban talking to each other. And meanwhile, Kirby Smart and Lincoln Riley are throwing haymakers in the Rose Bowl, man. And when we think about where the sport is now, it's not a direct comparison with Kirby Smart and Nick Saban. Of course it is. And you and I and everybody else in college football has made that direct comparison 1,000 times. But we think about Saban and Swinney, Nick and Dabo on the biggest stage, what that national rivalry was. And could Kirby and Lincoln be next? Could Georgia and USC, especially in the 12-team world that's coming, become coastal rivals? They're as far apart as you can get, schematically, philosophically, geographically, but are they going to be banging heads? Oh, I can't wait. This is why we're doing this. It was such a good idea. It's the undercard. It's the evolution. And now here we are, 6 years removed, and the future is here, Shehan, and this is just the beginning kernel of it. Would we have known that then? When we're watching Lincoln Riley in year 1 and Kirby Smart in year 2 meeting in a playoff semifinal, did we know, should we have known, Shehan, that this truly was the future of college football?
So I feel like by the end of the game, I thought it might be. Like by the end of the game, when I saw how good this game was, when I saw how close this game was, when I saw this contrast in styles and philosophies, it was sort of I feel like I'm going to remember this game. One thing that was interesting rewatching this game was back in 2017, that season, I was covering the Big 12. I was covering them for Cox Media Group. And so I watched that game much more from an Oklahoma perspective than viewing it kind of with both teams or seeing truly the Georgia side of things. I did live in the state of Georgia, so I did get to hear about it. But you know, you kind of watch it in a different way when that's the team that you're primarily covering. And so I think that was also another really interesting thing of just getting to rewatch it, was kind of going back and seeing, wow, you know, this Georgia team, you saw the vision for it. And I think you also saw the flaws. You saw what had to change in order for Georgia to really become what Georgia has become.
All right, so let's do this. By the way, you guys can go watch this. It's on. Don't tell anybody. I think people get sued. Don't tell anybody, but it's on YouTube. It's not like Shehan recorded this and sent me a VHS in the mail. Hey, Doug, I still have this in my... So we watched it on YouTube. Of course, as you know, it is a 54-48 double overtime win for number 3 Georgia over number 2 Oklahoma. And we have categories for this. I have done this 20 times on our Ohio State podcast where we rewatch old Ohio State games. We have not done it on the College Football Survivor Show before, but I borrowed a lot of categories from that. But also we have a specific goal in mind here. We are evaluating, we are going into the past to learn about Lincoln Riley and Kirby Smart. So the first question, Shehan, is this the full Kirby? Is this the full Lincoln? Let's start with Lincoln Riley. In year 1, watching this game, and if we were to watch it side by side with a USC game from last year, would it feel vastly different, or did you feel like Lincoln Riley hit the ground running? They went to Ohio State and won in the middle of that season in year 1 for him. Was he already basically who he would be as a head coach by this point at the end of his first season? So
for Lincoln, I put it at about 80%. I do think that this is mostly the same person as the coach who took the field in 2017. You know, obviously he's learned from experience. I think that obviously he's prioritized different roster groups, for example, and position groups to maybe build. And I think that he has some of the same flaws that maybe you saw during that 2017 game as well, in terms of some game management things, obviously some defensive things, some roster building things I think were still in question. So I think that this was a lot of the same stuff. I think one thing to mention, and this I think is less of a Lincoln Riley than just a college football thing, is I would say that Lincoln Riley, to me, is the number 1 offensive mind in college football. And the reason that I'd say that is because I think that he is as versatile as anybody in college football from a schematic perspective. So this was like Mark 1. This was like the first version of it, and college football has adjusted to it. And so, you know, one thing that I really noticed with this 2017 team is it was extremely reliant on big plays. It was about creating these mismatches and these chunk plays. And obviously, I think in the second half, Georgia was able to take some of those away in a different kind of way. Well, now I think that the Caleb Williams version, even the later Oklahoma versions, were a little less reliant on big plays. I think that they were able to handle maybe the short and mid game stuff just a little bit better. You know, obviously I covered the 2013, 2014 Baylor teams. There were aspects of that with this where it was a lot of either taking shots or keeping things close. I think that Lincoln uses the intermediate part of the field a little bit better now than he did in the past. But I think when you look at it from a pure DNA perspective, a lot of this is the same Lincoln Riley, for better and for worse.
I think maybe more for worse. He's great. He's great. He's great. But I think the reason it feels like a pretty decent representation of Lincoln Riley is because he hasn't fully evolved yet. I think there's a next evolution of Lincoln Riley that something maybe is going to have to go wrong at USC for him to get there. Can I get my thing? I was like, you're supposed to save. I think in podcasting, you're supposed to save stuff for the end. I can't save it. I can't. I have my big, gigantic conclusion.
I got it. Yeah.
Kirby Smart's a coach. Lincoln Riley's a play caller.
Okay. Yeah.
This is Kirby.
Yeah.
We didn't know. Kirby arrived fully formed, and he got caught in quarterback purgatory for a couple years. And then they got the quarterback play figured out. And there's also some defensive stuff we have to talk about with Georgia. Kirby Smart is fully involved in every aspect of the game. He's jumping into special teams huddles. He's calling timeouts. It feels like he has his arms around every aspect of the game. And Lincoln Riley feels like he has his head buried in a play sheet. And I don't know how different we are from 2017 today. Some people in Georgia got mad at me because I brought up what happened with Jalen Carter, with the tragedy at Georgia, and I take that into account when I evaluate Kirby Smart and Georgia. And some Georgia people got mad. That's not what this conversation is about. We've had that conversation. This is a football conversation. Kirby Smart is tremendous. And as someone who was not paying a ton of attention to Georgia football back then, he's been this from the jump, and that it took. I feel so bad for the thing that you keep bringing up. I'm like, why'd you rank up so low, Doug? It's like, because I'm an idiot. I'm an idiot. Just the way he talks about stuff, the way you see him coaching on the sideline, Shehan. This is something I thought that I got a handle on it just being at the Georgia-Ohio State semifinal last year, that you could feel Kirby Smart in every aspect of Georgia football. And I'll say this because, of course, people know I've covered Ohio State for almost 2 decades. I wind up seeing a lot of college football through that lens. Ryan Day is similar and compared to Lincoln Riley because they are quarterback guys, because they are offensive guys, because they are play callers. That's a lot of their DNA is similar. What we end up talking about on our Ohio State podcast a lot is Ryan Day needs to evolve like Kirby Smart. You might be like Lincoln Riley. You want to learn from Kirby Smart. So I think 80% of Lincoln Riley, is this the full Lincoln? I think it is 80% of Lincoln in year one, because I don't know how much Lincoln's evolved as a full head coach since then. Because by the way, when it got a little dicey in Oklahoma, he left. I think this is a really good representation of the full Kirby, not because Kirby Smart hasn't evolved, but he was, I think, remarkably evolved for a second-year head coach at this time. So I might also put this at 80% of Kirby. So to me, it's the same number, but for exactly opposite reasons. And I come away from this game so impressed with every aspect of Kirby Smart and thinking he is going to destroy college football for the next 2 decades. And I come away from this game wondering, when is Lincoln Riley going to get it all together? And am I wrong? Because, man, I felt it with every fiber of my being every second of watching this.
So that's interesting that you kind of frame it that way. You know, for me, when I'm thinking of percent fully formed Kirby Smart, I'm also thinking of it from a schematic perspective. I'm also thinking of it from a roster building perspective. It is worth noting, this is year 2 for Kirby Smart. This is before the top 2 recruiting classes and when they're just like throwing this much talent on the field, right? So obviously that's context. I will say the one thing in this game is I hope he's not listening to this. Jim Chaney just stared out at the screen from me for the entire game, and I'm like, what are we doing here? Well, how is this the plan?
So for people who aren't Georgia football experts, Jim Chaney is the offensive coordinator in this game. Yes. He remains the offensive coordinator through the 2018 season. Then he leaves to go to Tennessee, which I think, right, that ushers in?
No, that's James Coley then. They have that 1 year.
And then Monken.
Yeah, and Coley is worse Jim Chaney. So much of watching Georgia's offensive snaps, and I, again, like you, I feel like I have 8 different things I want to say at the same time, so I gotta really just focus on one. Watching them line up, it is unbelievable the extent to which almost their entire roster on a third of their plays is basically within the hashes. It is just unbelievable the limited amount of space that Georgia used on offense. And I know they have big guys who can maul, but one thing, especially in that first half, was that Georgia was figuring out, hey man, Oklahoma can kind of hang in the middle there. They actually did a pretty good job in the middle. They had to figure out that they needed to get to the edge in order to have any success. And it's just in contrast to seeing the way that Todd Monken would come out and would use misdirection and use space, and just the way that he'd use the middle of the field in the passing game was unbelievable. And one thing is, I'm going to say one thing is a lot of times because there's so many things, but
it's so fun. It's so fun to watch old games and form conclusions.
I get, especially in 2019, which is 2 years after this, I get why Jake Fromm gets so criticized for his time at Georgia. But holy crap, did Georgia just try to put him in the worst situations possible all the time?
I have a particularly hot take about how the future of college football would have changed if something in this game changed. And it is related to that. I do think it is a reminder of Georgia is so good. But I think you watch this program where it is right now. But you watch this game and you watch the shortcomings of the offensive coordinator and the quarterback, who is a very young quarterback at this point.
Yeah, he's a freshman, a true freshman in this game.
So for a true freshman, he's pretty good. But when you compare what Georgia play calling, scheme, and quarterback control of the game, compare this Georgia team to last year's Georgia team, again, maybe a little less than 21 when it's a defense first team. The offense first Georgia team of last year with Todd Monken and Stetson Bennett in sync, it would put me on alert as a Georgia fan of, if you go back to an offense that looks more like this, now that Todd Monken is gone and now that you don't have an experienced locked-in quarterback, I would be nervous. Because there is also something here that happens with the Georgia offense that you cannot count on in the modern day. This passing game is not good enough. There are not dynamic people in this passing game catching the ball. There's no Brock Bowers, but there's no dynamic play from the quarterback or from the play calling, Shehan. And so if Monken and Stetson got you here to 2 straight national titles and you take them both away, if you revert to a Chaney, freshman Fromm kind of offense for Georgia this year, I would be worried.
No, I agree. And I don't anticipate that's going to happen. Again, Mike Bobo is from, he is the journeyman offensive coordinator in the SEC. He spent last year working with Todd Monken as an analyst. I think that Georgia understands where its bread is buttered. Again, you look at last season, you look at the national championship game, this was, to me, an offensive program. People can argue. I mean, Georgia was obviously incredible defensively as well, but I think that if Kirby Smart does not take away from these last 2 years that offense is very important to also winning national championships, then he's not as good a coach as we think. And I think he is as good a coach as we think. So I'm not especially worried about that. But you see, so when we asked what percent fully formed is Kirby Smart in this game, I said about 40%. I think that you're right about the head coaching aspects and his style, right? You see these Nick Saban assistants come off, and Jeremy Pruitt wasn't doing this stuff, right? Being a complete head coach, like you talk about. I think that Will Muschamp struggled to be a full head coach. He was a defensive guy, Jim McElwain, et cetera, et cetera. Kirby Smart understood that it's not just about owning one part of the roster. It's about owning every detail of the program. I think that is clear right from the start. Something I talk about all the time with the Texas high school football guys is people can talk about their recruiting and what they're going to do in recruiting, but they were good right away. And Kirby Smart, similar deal here. He's going to have number 1 and number 2 classes. This was not that roster. And you can see that in some of the shortcomings in this game. But the fact that he was able to already deliver this roster to this point in year 2, I think is also a testament to who he was. But there was some growing for him to do in terms of roster management. There was some growing for him to do in terms of certainly the offensive side of the ball. And I think that he's a better coach for it now, having gone through that.
All right, quick break. So much more to get into. There are so many superstars in this game that you learn about by watching this game. Baker Mayfield and CeeDee Lamb and Nick Chubb and Roquan Smith and Sony Michel. There are so many interesting people to talk about, and there are so many more conclusions to draw. We'll do all that next on the College Football Survivor Show. The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. All right, Shehan, so the next category you have is who owned the game. And I'm going to go with the Georgia running backs in this game, because what Sony Michel, but particularly Nick Chubb, do in this game. Sony Michel carries 11 times for 181 and 3 touchdowns. Nick Chubb carries 14 times for 145 and 2 touchdowns. Overall, Georgia runs it 34 times for 317 yards. They average 9.3 yards per carry. Sony Michel is named the offensive player of the game, in part because he has the touchdown run to win it in double overtime. I will say, watching this, though, they're both extraordinary. The idea that Bill Belichick drafted Sony Michel instead of Nick Chubb, and Sony Michel goes at the end of the first round, and Nick Chubb is there early in the second round for the Cleveland Browns, I don't know how you watch this game and think that Sony Michel is better. Because it feels like to me that Sony Michel is running through holes and like taking the yards that are there, and Nick Chubb is making yards. Nick Chubb is hitting cutback lanes the way he hits them in the NFL. Nick Chubb has a 53-yard touchdown run where he breaks 3 tackles. He absolutely should be down. He will not be stopped. Everything that Nick Chubb is in the NFL is on display in this game, and Bill Belichick took Sony Michel. So as much as I thought this running game owned the game, and I want to talk about that more in context of Georgia, I thought Chubb first. What is Sony Michel? Sony Michel might be a scooch faster. Nick Chubb, it's like, hey, did you guys get your block? Doesn't matter. Nick Chubb's going to get his yards anyway, man.
No, I think you're right. I actually had all 3 running backs in this game as the guys that owned it. You know, you mentioned those 2 guys, Rodney Anderson for Oklahoma, who, by the way, had never done anything like this before in his life, rushed for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns in this game. The part that was interesting, because I think Rodney Anderson really owned the first half of this game, and then the Georgia running backs, and I'd also throw in Roquan Smith, owned the second. Roquan Smith had a terrible first half. He was nowhere to be found. He was getting juked out of his shoes. I think that maybe we'll get to the way that things changed a little bit more a little later. But, this was a running game. And this is one of the things that I think was so interesting just watching this game was both teams, I think, especially in that first half, had trouble getting running backs on the ground. Like, these running backs were getting to the edge, were getting in space. Like I mentioned, I think Oklahoma did a decent job up the middle. But once they realized, and one of the reasons why I think that Sony Michel ended up having more yards and winning player of the game, like once they got to the edge, it was kind of over, right? We had multiple plays in this game. There was a big one where Nick Chubb has this breakaway 50-yard touchdown run where he is tackled 3 times and doesn't go down. Like fully tackled, fully has a guy on top of him, does not go down. His lower leg drive in this game is unbelievable. I think that sort of thing is just much more valuable when you're talking, especially to project an NFL running back, is having the ability to make things happen in tight windows. Sony Michel, I don't want to reduce him to a scat back because he is much more than that. But that was more of his game. He was more getting to the edge. He was more creating space outside. I think Nick Chubb was capable of doing both. So I think you're right. I mean, I don't know why I thought this. I think that I'm like combining Nick Chubb and Todd Gurley in my head. I thought that Nick Chubb was a top 10 pick, but you're right. He went, of course, after Sony Michel, which in hindsight feels ridiculous.
Having covered the Cleveland Browns for a chunk of this, the game starts with the handshake and Nick Chubb and Baker Mayfield shake hands. And it's like, oh, what could have been? Because we're going to have some Baker Mayfield thoughts coming later in this podcast as well. The thing that I think is interesting about this, and I want to hold off on Rodney Anderson for a second, because the point I want to make about the Georgia backs is if they don't have a defense-destroying run game, they don't win.
Right.
And so what Georgia is now, they're good. Like, we like the Georgia. Kendall Milton's good. Kenny McIntosh was good. They don't have Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, and by the way, DeAndre Swift is their 3rd running back in this game. Without that, they're done. They're cooked in this game because the passing game is not there at all. So, and we'll get into the Georgia defense later. This is what's carrying them. So the idea that early on that Kirby Smart in year 2 can make a college football playoff with a freshman quarterback and a defense that honestly is not super talented. How did they do it? Because these running backs are unbelievable. This run game. And again, Chaney's maybe not dialing up a lot of stuff. You hit a couple cutback lanes, you get to the edge with some speed, and it can look easy. And it can look easy against an absolutely out of place, not filling the correct gaps, overmatched Oklahoma defense. But this combo for these 2 backs, Shehan, to combine for 320 rushing yards, it is a stunningly dominant performance that, as good as Georgia has been, and this is them early on, they don't have a featured back. They play multiple guys. They always are going to have 2 or 3 backs. They're not this right now in the run game, which is why there's so much more put on the defense in the passing game, because honestly, Michel and Chubb practically won this game on their own.
Oh, absolutely. And again, we've talked about generations before where Georgia had Todd Gurley, Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, DeAndre Swift in quick succession. And they haven't had a guy like that since then. It hasn't mattered because the rest of the team has risen to their level. But this stuff isn't guaranteed. Zamir White was supposed to be kind of that guy. He was the number 1 running back in the country. Didn't really happen for a variety of reasons, including injuries. And I will say I was amused. I finished the overtime periods. I watched them probably about an hour ago. Very, very amusing to see DeAndre Swift and Kyler Murray both come onto the field at different points in that game because they didn't play big roles in the game, but it was just like, oh, hey, look at that. But no, I think you're right. This was a team that used stars to cover up a lot of holes because they didn't necessarily have the depth of talent that they would have later. You saw, again, Nick Chubb, Sony Michel on offense. I think that you saw, especially in that second half, like I mentioned, Roquan Smith. You saw Lorenzo Carter, who's somebody that we're going to talk about later, get in there. But this was not a team that had 22 guys on the field at every one time that they could trust. And great individual efforts were able to pull them over the top.
So I wanted to save Rodney Anderson because our next category is the underappreciated player of the game. And this is where I had Rodney Anderson. And it's actually because I think he's underappreciated for who he is in his career. Yeah. Do you know how many NFL rushing yards Rodney Anderson had?
Did he have none?
0.
Yeah, because he had major injuries when he was at Oklahoma. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think he tried to come back the year after this and kind of dealt with injuries.
He did come back. He blew his knee out in the second or third game of 2018.
Yeah, and so he should have just gone, of course. I mean, this is one of those cautionary tales, but he was somebody who in his career, I believe he played at Katy High School down in Houston. He just could never get the injury thing right. And this was the one game that he had. By the way, did you notice who Oklahoma's second running back was in this game?
Future Ohio State Buckeye Trey Sermon. Is that who you're talking about?
Trey Sermon. That's right.
It's remarkable the people that pop up here. Rodney Anderson in his career, he has 1 carry for 5 yards in 2015. He's hurt in 2016. He has a good year this season in 2017. He's a 1,000-yard rusher. And then he has 11 carries for 119 yards in 2018, gets hurt, and then never carries the ball in the NFL. So he has a total of, after this game in his life, he has 11 more carries in games. Man. And he looks like he belongs with Sony Michel and Nick Chubb in this game. He is fast. He's got a burst. He hits a hole. This is a moment. I almost wish Rodney Anderson was on this podcast with us because I don't know what he has going on, but it should have worked out better for him. And it didn't. He keeps Lincoln Riley in this game. He absolutely keeps Lincoln Riley in this game because Oklahoma throws it well in the first half. They completely fall apart throwing the ball in the second half. But Rodney Anderson, and as you said, he kind of was better in the first half, but it's just an appreciation for a guy with terrible injury luck, who is just puts on a it's a 200-yard performance. He's the leading rusher in this game.
Yeah.
He has more rushing yards than either Chubb or Michel because they're sharing the load. He's carrying the load. He's 26 for 201 and 2 scores. It's unbelievable. So Rodney Anderson, tip of the cap to you, my friend. Awesome player. Wish it would have worked out better.
Yeah, he deserves a lot better than what he got. My underappreciated player of the game, we mentioned him briefly. I think it is a little underrated what Jake Fromm had to do in the waning moments of this game. I don't think that they win this game without his final drive of the fourth quarter. It wasn't. Now we have Stetson Bennett, so we have the legendary drives that Stetson Bennett put together. But before that, I mean, this was one of the big drives I think that they've had in a while. There was a huge play with about 2:40 left in the game. Georgia has 1st and 10. They're at about the 40-yard line, and he is dead to rights. DJ Ward for Oklahoma has him dead to rights. He kind of manages to get out of it and flips it over to, I believe, Sony Michel, who takes it down to within the 25-yard line. And then like that's just like a huge play in the game. He then makes a big pass down the middle. I can't remember who the receiver was who caught that pass. Maybe Javon Wims. And like they scored a touchdown right after that. Those were two of the biggest plays of the game. There's no reason that Oklahoma should have been in overtime in this game. They should have just won this game. But I think that in those moments, Jake Fromm made those right plays. And again, especially because of 2019 when James Coley took over as offensive coordinator, and Coley was really just not very good at all. And I think set this program back in a way that maybe it needed to force them to hire Todd Monken. But in 2017, like he just did all those little things. He had some great pre-snap reads that actually helped set up a couple of their touchdowns and big plays. Like he had the head game to him. Now, he was limited as a passer. He was never going to be what Georgia needed as a passer long term. And certainly we can talk about the decisions that Kirby Smart made in terms of quarterbacks in 2018. But I think that he had a really nice game, even though the final stat line maybe didn't show all of it.
So we're going to talk about that decision right now, because
Okay.
I think this is one of my other big hot takes. Because again, he should be sacked on the play you're talking about, back at the 50-yard line, and basically kill the drive. Instead, they get down. It's a 27-yard play that he escapes the sack and then dumps it off to Sony Michel. Then he rips that third down throw. I think if Jake Fromm does not lead them back here and force overtime and then to win in overtime, I think Justin Fields never is an Ohio State Buckeye. Because I think the remnants of this, what Jake Fromm does in the clutch with a couple of these plays to save Georgia and keep Georgia alive and get them to the national title game, lingers. What are you going to bench that guy?
Right.
Then you're going to bench the guy who marched you down the field the next year? And what he winds up being is a fine, but not great starting quarterback for Georgia in 2018 and 2019. And if you are a great, great program with national championship aspirations, the worst thing that can happen to you is to settle on a fine but not great quarterback over the long term. You're better off with the guy being terrible and you figuring it out and getting to somebody new. Jake Fromm saved their bacon. He is so clutch that it keeps Kirby smiling. They have like Justin Fields in a wrinkle package in 18, and Justin Fields is like, what are we doing here? And transfers to Ohio State. If he just gets sacked there, and that's it, Oklahoma beat him. Jake Fromm, like, it's not his fault, but then I think you would look at this game, and I think you could watch this game, especially the first half when Baker Mayfield was on, and you could see the difference in what's the difference of having a dynamic quarterback. And I think if Georgia would have lost Shehan, you would have said, hey, man, Jake Fromm's good, but we need to elevate at quarterback. We've experienced it now. Our quarterback play was good, but not great in our semifinal loss to Oklahoma. Jake, thanks for your service. Justin Fields, we think he's got it. Quarterback change. Instead, Jake Fromm saves him, and we rewrite the next couple years of college football history, not for one program, but for two.
Well, and I think another interesting question about this is when you talk about Georgia, if Oklahoma comes away with this game, let's say, for example, that they kind of finish what they did in the first half and it ends up being a 14-point game, let's say. Does this expedite Georgia's change to a more modern offense? Do they decide that this is not something that's palatable to stick with Jim Chaney into 2018 and to James Coley in 2019? Do they make that change sooner?
I think we are setting up a scenario where Georgia's miracle win in this game sets them back. And I don't even think we're joking.
I know.
Because we are looking at Kirby Smart, who is ready to lead a championship program. He stuck at Bama till he was ready. He's ready. There are things around him that aren't ready, and moves he's not ready to make yet. But then it's hard to change when you win, man. And what? So you go lose to Bama because Saban puts in the backup quarterback in the championship game? What? Like you're gonna clean house because of that? Come on. But this, like, we're not good enough to beat Oklahoma. We're just not good enough. We're good. We're not good enough. I think we might have gotten to the modern version of Georgia 2 years earlier. We're saying like, why did it take? Like it's an understandable, normal progression for Kirby Smart to have won his first national title when he did. I think maybe he would have won one earlier if they would have lost this game. because you and I have just given two examples of it. They get to a different quarterback sooner. They get to a different coordinator sooner.
Well, and the funny thing about it is Kirby Smart was defensive coordinator at Alabama for, I think it's like 8 years. So a pretty decent amount of time. Think about when he leaves. It's after the 2015 season. So in 2014, that's the first year of the Kiffin experiment. They go to Blake Sims, and it kind of backfires on them when they play Ohio State. 2015, they go back to more of a game manager in Jake Coker, who just like does some things and makes some plays. One of the funnier national championship winning quarterbacks I think that we've had in a little while. And then he leaves. So in 2016, you see the switch to Jalen Hurts, and 16 isn't the best year for Hurts, but 17 he's better. 18 they switch to Tua, and it's on, right? Like then that's the change. That's when they are like what we think of like this crazy dynamic passing game. 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama, both dynamic passing teams. So I wonder, in some ways, does that change happen quicker too, philosophically, for Kirby Smart? If, again, this isn't like a scenario that makes sense, but if he became a head coach off of the 2018 Alabama season or the 2019 SEC season, as opposed to, well, look, we tried the exciting thing with Blake Sims, and then we went to, some more traditional quarterback in Jake Coker, and that was actually the thing that won us the national championship.
Yeah, there's just this is why this game's so important, because again, there's a lot of decisions that are made on both sides here, and Kirby Smart and Lincoln Riley are so important to what college football is, and so is this guy. Where did he come from? A player who comes from out of nowhere in this game. And you mentioned it already. I'm going to go with Kyler Murray because in overtime, they put Kyler Murray in. They run an option play. They have two quarterbacks in the backfield. They have Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray. And Baker Mayfield pitches the ball to Kyler Murray and nothing happens. And then they take him out. But Kirk Herbstreit saying like, oh, Kyler Murray, oh, he just transferred here. Oh, he's a pretty good athlete. They think he's going to be the starting quarterback next year. And it's like, you think? Oh, you do? Is that how that's going to go? And it's crazy. He goes to the sideline. He takes his helmet off. He looks like he's 12. It's like, look at little Kyler Murray. He got to play a snap. And also, this is like a bigger question about Lincoln Riley. Lincoln Riley, he's putting in the backup quarterback for a play to get an option toss in overtime. Does that make Lincoln Riley an offensive mastermind and a genius? Or does it make you think, what are you doing? This is not week 3 against Weber State. It's a playoff semifinal. Run a normal play.
So my thing is, I love the idea of having multiple quarterbacks on the field, and I'm kind of shocked that we haven't seen a team really commit to it. According to my sources, which is to say somebody who works with me at CBS who went to Sacramento State, apparently Troy Taylor did that a little bit at Sacramento State. So like maybe that's coming to Stanford, which sounds hilarious, frankly. But like, obviously, if you're just going to run an option play, like just an option play, I assume there would be like a passing component off of it. But no, he just like ran to the sideline and that was it. That sucked. That was lame. Don't do that.
I think this is a quote from either Chris Fowler or Kirk Herbstreit. They told us he's one of the fastest players on the entire roster.
That's true.
This young Kyler Murray, they say. So it's like, yeah, no, I think it's going to work out for him. Just not on that play. Who did you have for the player coming from out of nowhere?
Yeah, so I had a couple. So one was Lorenzo Carter on that block, the blocked field goal in double overtime. That was just like he had a good game. He was kind of involved in everything, but that was just oh my goodness, like that's just an athlete making a play. I didn't even think that Oklahoma blocked it all that badly. Like I thought that they protected okay, but he just found that window and made that gap, and it was just an unbelievable play. Like I mentioned, the DeAndre Swift one where you see him get in and you're like, man, that's their third guy. That's crazy. He only got 4 carries. He didn't really contribute to the game, but big time player, and he ended up being even bigger down the road. And one guy for Oklahoma who I noticed was Kenneth Murray. Kind of had a breakout game. There were moments, he's a linebacker for Oklahoma. He ended up being a first-round pick down the road in the 2020 draft and became like a first-team All-Big 12 player, really, really good player. And there were just these moments where he looked incredible, and there were these moments where he looked like Jim Chaney had him in a body bag. Like he had no idea what he was doing. So it was fun to kind of, and this is true with a lot of these players and on both of these teams, it was fun to see these guys who down the road started to finally figure it out. We saw fewer of them on the Georgia defense because this was a pretty senior heavy defense, but getting to see some of these names that really showed up down the road was a lot of fun.
Yeah, there were a couple long Georgia runs where it was like, oh, that was weird that there wasn't a linebacker in that gap. And it was like, oh, Kenneth Murray was supposed to be. He just went the wrong way because he's a freshman. And what are they doing? So, yeah, I guess he made some good plays. There were just moments of just absolute collapse from this Oklahoma defense that are almost breathtaking to analyze. And we'll keep getting to those. Big coaching moment of the game. This, to me, is an encapsulation of Lincoln Riley as a play caller, Kirby Smart as a coach. Oklahoma dominates the first half. They score another touchdown on a great little wrinkle play, a reverse where CeeDee Lamb winds up throwing a touchdown pass to Baker Mayfield. It's a great play call by a play caller. And then Oklahoma comes out and tries to squib kick it, kicks it right into the gut of a Georgia guy standing like 4 yards from the ball. Georgia gets the ball on the opposite side of the 50, throws like a 10-yard out and kicks a field goal. This happens in the final 6 seconds. Oklahoma's kicking off, I think, with 6 seconds left. They get a recovered kick. They throw it out. Kirby Smart, master of the running timeout. They don't get out of bounds. He gets the timeout called with 1 second left, just like he does against Ohio State in the semifinal last year when Ohio State's going to run a fake on them. And Kirby Smart calls the timeout. Why? Because he's coaching every second, because he's aware of everything, because he has his arms around every part of the game. Georgia gets 3 free points in a game that goes to overtime because Kirby Smart is a coach and Lincoln Riley is a play caller. And it is an absolutely disastrous end to a first half that was completely dominated by the Oklahoma offense, Shehan. And then they asked like Lincoln Riley, oh, what happened? Oh, that was kind of a weird. He's like, well, we tried to squib it and we didn't execute it right. What are you doing? It was awful. 6 seconds left. It's 31-14 on a trick play. And it's 31-17 going to the half, Shehan. It made my head spin.
Yeah, I'm going to fold this in with another category, my game-saving moment. I think that, just like you said, that decision ultimately swung the game in a big way. But it was that sequence by Georgia, not just at the end of the half, but also at the beginning of the next half as well. So you have the weirdo squib, like, come on, man, that's not what a squib kick is. What do you think a squib kick is? It's not that. That honestly looked more like an onside kick because of how bad it was. But
yeah,
you have this decision. Georgia kicks a 55-yard field goal off of the great pass with 1 second left, by the way. This is an example of an SEC coach calling a timeout with 1 second left and it being a good decision. But Georgia's able to get that on the board. That makes it a 2-score game. And what would have happened if Oklahoma had done literally anything else, is they would have been up 3 scores and they would have gotten the ball back to start the second half. Could have been a huge swing, probably would have been a game-defining swing, probably would have ended the game. If they had scored a touchdown there, the game would have been over. What ends up happening instead is it's a 2-score game. Oklahoma goes 3 and out, and actually another part of that is they took the ball out of the end zone on the return when they didn't need to, got backed up to the 17-yard line. They have to punt. Georgia gets it at the 50-yard line, and on the first play of the second half, Nick Chubb has his big touchdown run where he breaks 3 tackles. And just like that, a 3-score game is a 1-score game because of 3 total Georgia plays. And that was kind of it. And then Oklahoma also had to punt on the next play. I believe Georgia scores again after that, and it's a tie ball game. That's it. That's it. Right? These are these little moments where I know that Clemson is like the program that talks all the time about the middle eight. But that was the epitome of wasting the middle eight. You were going to get the ball back to start the second half. All you had to do was not make things worse. And Georgia managed to pounce on every little opportunity that they had. I mean it. Oklahoma had no excuse not to win this game. They were up 17 points with 6 seconds left in the first half, and were going to receive the ball. To waste that comes down to complete mismanagement.
I feel like right at this, already in their careers, Kirby Smart is a little picture guy. He is a details guy. Lincoln Riley is a big picture guy. we're going to attack people like this. And I think what has happened is Kirby over time has grown in the big picture, recruiting, hiring, right? Like offensive style, that kind of thing, while continuing to remain detail oriented and on top of everything, from his team doing yoga to start practice to calling timeouts. They called 2 timeouts at the end of this game just to make sure that they're set up defensively, right? That Kirby, he's just on top of everything. And I don't know that Lincoln's there. Like Lincoln Riley, like, hey, we're going to have a Heisman quarterbacks and we're going to throw the ball and we have a nice offensive scheme. But like the little things, Kirby Smart maximized his team in this game. And I think Oklahoma, I don't want to say he minimized his team, but they didn't get everything out of this game that they should have. And I think that really came to the forefront. Let's move on to the speed or strength moment, because we'll continue to talk about some big picture stuff. A moment where a dude looked fast, a moment where a dude looked strong. Shehan, what do you have for this?
So the Nick Chubb touchdown that I mentioned was just an unbelievable feat of strength, breaking 3 tackles that should have been made, including one by a defensive tackle who I believe was 320 pounds, Amani Bledsoe. Just unreal stuff. That was an individual effort. They didn't block it that well. They didn't set it up all that well. I think that the receivers actually did a pretty good job of blocking on the outside, but like, you don't make 50-yard touchdown runs because Javon Wims did a pretty good job of blocking, right? Like, that was a Nick Chubb play and he made it happen. For Oklahoma, Marquise Brown, Hollywood Brown, had this play in the first half where Baker kind of swings it to the outside and Hollywood just off to the races. He goes 45 yards, as opposed to breaking tackles, he just has defenders whiffing tackles all around him. They can't even get a hand on him. If it was 2-touch, he wouldn't have been down, and they get him down, I believe, at the 11-yard line. And they said, one other thing, you mentioned that play, the CeeDee Lamb passing play. That was kind of the Philly special a month before the Philly special. Yeah. The Philly special happened a month later. So actually, if Oklahoma could have not tripped all over itself, we'd be calling it the Baker special.
This is worth talking about here. CeeDee Lamb and Hollywood Brown are the 2 leading receivers for Oklahoma in this game, both first-round picks. CeeDee Lamb's young, but he's there. There's a drive near the end of the first half that I think maybe gets held to a field goal or leads to Oklahoma's first punt, where CeeDee Lamb has 2 drops on the same drive. I think it was a field goal drive. It's like, okay, this isn't great. And then later in the game, after Oklahoma's dead and it looks like they've forgotten how to play offense, he makes a catch on a sideline ball from Baker Mayfield that was like, oh, no, that's a first-round thing. So you can see young CD growing up. And they also have Mark Andrews, who's going to go on to be a 3rd-round pick and become one of the best tight ends in the NFL. This is another thing. As we think about the future of Lincoln Riley, you think, okay, well, is Lincoln Riley ever going to have better skill players than he had this year? CeeDee Lamb, Hollywood Brown, Mark Andrews, and by the way, in this game, a running back who ran for 200 yards, and, oh, by the way, a 5th-year Heisman-winning quarterback. For all the things that we are waiting for USC to become, Caleb Williams, they're going to have these receivers. I don't know this could be better than this. And, he found a way to not win with this. This is unbelievable talent, Shehan, when you think about the guys with their hands on the ball. Speed and strength, like CeeDee Lamb and Marquise Brown are setting people on fire. They march. Oklahoma marches right down the field first 2 possessions. I think Marquise Brown catches a touchdown in the back of the end zone after the first drive to end the first drive, put Oklahoma up 7-0. And it feels like, is this game going to be 88-0? Is Georgia never going to stop Oklahoma? Because they are so on point. And by the way, their left tackle's Orlando Brown, another first-round guy. This is ridiculous. They have everything you would want in an offense. And when it's clicking, it absolutely looks unstoppable. That includes speed and strength.
I will say, well, first of all, Orlando Brown, remember, fell to the 3rd because he had a bad combine and people were like, he can't play football. Right. And then it turns out he's actually awesome. Like all of us expected. God, I hate the NFL draft, man. It's so dumb. If it were me, I would recommend that the NFL simply not try to sign Orlando Brown, and then he can maybe sign with the Chicago Bears, but that's beside the point. So to answer your question, I get what you mean. I mean, this is an incredible collection of skill talents, but this is kind of what Lincoln Riley's had every year, basically. He's had this level. Now, 2021 was a little bit of a weird year from a skill talent perspective, but like, even you look at his first year at USC, I'm not saying that they're going to end up being CeeDee Lamb and Hollywood Brown types or Mark Andrews types, but he had the Biletnikoff winner in Jordan Addison. They just added Zachariah Branch, who's a top 5 player in the country this offseason. I think he's going to, this is just what I think you come to expect from Lincoln Riley. I do think that he is going to have that level of talent. Now, I do think it's an interesting question, especially now being at USC and not having Bill Biedenbaugh anymore, his offensive line coach. Their offensive line, I think, played pretty well last year, especially given how many guys they had to kind of bring in to replace. We'll have to see whether he can have those elite level 2017 and 2018 offensive lines. But yeah, I do think that we can't trust Lincoln Riley to have this level of skill talent most of the time.
So maybe I should phrase it differently. This was, according to Football Outsiders, the number 1 ranked offense in the country in 2017, 51st ranked defense. So maybe it's not that he can't have this again, but like he's had this. It's not like you're going to have...
Right. You're not going to have a lot better.
Wait until Lincoln Riley really gets his guys. Then we'll see. It's like, you mean like in 2017 Oklahoma when they blew a huge first half lead in the semifinal? Not that they weren't good. They were excellent, but they couldn't get over the top with that. So if you think, hey, Caleb Williams and Zachariah Branch and adding Dorian Singer and all these things at USC, oh, that's going to make up. It's not better. It is not better than 2017 Oklahoma offensively. Maybe it's as good, but if you're talking about winning a national championship, if you're talking about winning a playoff game, this turned out not to be enough because of other reasons. So I just want people to know, like, this is not just in scheme. And by the way, Lincoln Riley was part of it, right? But what a nice, Bob Stoops quitting. Oh man, really? I have to be the head coach? Yeah, well, here. CeeDee Lamb, Hollywood Brown, Mark Andrews, Baker Mayfield, Orlando Brown, Rodney Anderson. What do you think, Lincoln? Can you make something of that in year 1? It's like, yeah, I'm good. They're extraordinary.
The point that we can say definitively is that skill talent is not going to be the thing that saves Lincoln Riley or takes him to the next level, because that is not the question that we have about him. And he will, I think, continue to have this level of talent, but something fundamental has to change in addition to maintaining what he's already doing.
So my speed strength moment is an overtime tackle by Roquan Smith on a 3rd and 2.
I know exactly which one you're talking about.
It is a huge moment. It's a 3rd and 2. They run like a little jet sweep handoff to receiver Jordan Smallwood. And I believe at that moment he is in his 4th year of college football, and it is the 4th carry of his career. And it is what they do on 3rd and 2 in overtime when you have Baker Mayfield, Rodney Anderson, CeeDee Lamb, Mark Andrews, and Hollywood Brown. Lincoln Riley, I guess you're a genius play caller. Nice play call, bad coaching. Because they get wide, and guess what? Roquan Smith makes a man-sized tackle. Because if Roquan Smith gets his hands on you, you're not falling forward. So it's stopped on 3rd and 2. They have to kick the first field goal in overtime. That is your 3rd and 2 play. There was a play earlier. I think it's CeeDee Lamb's first catch very early in the game. CeeDee Lamb has single coverage on the outside before the snap. He's waving his arms at Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield's like, oh, yeah, you guys single coverage. I see you. And then he just, guess what? He runs a slant, gets position. Baker Mayfield hits him in the chest, and they get a first down. And then when it's money time, they hand off. You know what would be a good tricky play? Hey, guys, I'm just spitballing here. What if we hand off to a guy who we never hand off to with our season on the line? You know, that would be tricky. What about all the first round talent? Nope. Let's get tricky. Roquan Smith doesn't get tricked, man. Roquan Smith is awesome. He's your guy. You're sad he's not a Bear anymore. He's tremendous. He's the heartbeat of this defense. But this defense, he's doing a little bit more by himself. There aren't 11 guys flying around to the ball like this, but he makes some manly man tackles in this game, hitting guys and stopping them in their tracks.
Do you think in 20 years we'll just be able to pretend that Roquan Smith did win a national championship? Because it's unfair. Like, I don't think it should be allowed for Roquan Smith to not have won a national title with the titles that they've won. He is so good. I mean, he is a heat-seeking missile. Nakobe Dean was incredible and obviously played a similar role on the 2021 Georgia team. But going back and watching, it's like if you could make Nakobe Dean grow 3 inches and be even faster. It's not fair. It's really just not fair. That play was astonishing. And I believe that was the same drive where they brought out the Kyler Murray play as well. I think that maybe they got a first down after that. But I believe it was in the same sequence. And to bring out 2 guys who were not part of your plans is just so strange. And I mean, because the other part of this too, because I don't mind mixing up your personnel and your coverages and things like that. But when you look at the stats, only 4 players in the entire game for Oklahoma caught more than 1 pass. By the way, it's CeeDee Lamb, it's Hollywood Brown, it's Mark Andrews, and it's one of the more underrated fullbacks I think we've had in college football, Dimitri Flowers, who actually I loved the way that that Lincoln Riley used Dimitri Flowers back in the day. I hope he gets a Dimitri Flowers at USC in some form or fashion, because like it's just so much fun. But like, why are you giving it to those guys? You have a running back who's run for 200 yards too. If you want to run the ball, then run the ball. But like, it was strange. It was really, really strange.
It's wild.
And the one thing that I'll say is that I don't think in the same way, although maybe he'd make me look dumb, I don't think that Lincoln Riley would call those plays with Kyler and Jordan Smallwood today. But at the same time, he just also kind of blew a terrible game to Tulane as well. So maybe he would. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the evolution. You better not stop giving it to guys who haven't played. Give it to your first rounders. Style check. That's something we do with one of these. It's like, hey, just like, does someone have a cool haircut, or does, on the Ohio State show, one time we did an Ohio State Michigan game from the 30s. So then we were like, oh, what was the style back then? Who had a nice fedora?
Was it different?
It was all black and white, so it was hard to tell. And nobody had style. I don't know. So I usually want to set the Rose Bowl on fire, because the Rose Bowl's like, we're beautiful. We can't move our date. All of college football should revolve around us. And then they do overhead blimp shots from the Rose Bowl. And I think, should every college football game be played at the Rose Bowl? So just like they just blimp their blimps off in this game. Could we get, it's like, how many blimp shots is too many blimp shots? And just the Oklahoma colors and the Georgia colors, it's a different shades, but they kind of meld nicely. And it's a beautiful day. And the Rose Bowl, in the moment, one day out of the year, the Rose Bowl never goes out of style. And the other 364 days of the year, they are completely out of style. But the reason they get to be jackholes and try to run college football is because for 3.5 hours, every January 1st, it's pretty stinking cool. So I thought this was pretty, grumble, grumble. It looks cool.
I went in a very different direction than you for style. One, I mean, obviously Baker Mayfield in college always had like the scarf thing on his head, like the headband thing. It's just like such a Baker look. I miss it, honestly. I also noticed that Sam Pittman on the sideline, offensive line coach at the time for Georgia, I noticed he was wearing transition lenses. I don't know why he would do that. Thankfully, I think we've reached a point in society where we don't really do that the same way anymore, but it was a very, we don't really see him in glasses anymore these days, but I don't know. He was in transition lenses. And speaking of glasses, have to shout out the god Rodrigo Blankenship, of course, with his giant sports goggles, missing a very makeable field goal at the beginning of the game and then hitting a 55-yarder at the end of the first half. So, when I was thinking about style, that's more the direction I went.
No, there is style all over the place, and we have to figure out when we're going to talk about Baker. It might be right here. It might be right here. Meme it. What could you make a meme of out of this game? So I do think there are times when like Baker takes off running down the sideline, and it's like, oh yeah, look, Baker, he's excited about everybody. At the end of the game, they do show him after
hunched over.
Georgia blocks the field goal, and then Sony Michel runs in for the game-winning touchdown, and he has his hands on his knees, he's bent over, and he looks like he wants to crawl into a hole. And that image of Baker Mayfield, like that's how his college football career ends. That's how his Heisman Trophy season ends. It's heartbreaking, because this guy did everything he wanted to that year except this, and you can just see it crushed him. So that'd be a good oh, I'm crushed. If you want to make a meme about, oh, I'm the saddest I've ever been, here is Baker Mayfield bent over on the sideline.
Yeah, I remember that one at the time, and I just remember being like, oh no, this is going to live literally forever. This is not just this will be a meme for a few days. This is we're going to show this clip in 50 years, and it's going to be Baker Mayfield hunched over on the sideline. And, the thing is, because Baker's such a unique player, and he's such a unique personality. I mean, he loved the trash talk. He loved the playing things up. And that's the sort of thing that I love about college football, right? Obviously, we have the planting the flag that same season at Ohio State. And Baker's always lived by the perspective that if I can give it, you can give it back, right? And nobody had been able to give it back. So that was that's the context of that moment, is that this was the first time obviously this year, but really in years, that we had ever seen Baker fail. And then you see him hunched over, you see all of that. It was a very memorable, powerful shot, I think. Obviously a meme as well. And one other thing too is, I think that one thing I'm really excited about in college football is to get to the point where we don't have the COVID year kind of weighing and hanging over things anymore. Because when Baker lost this game, it was over. It wasn't well, let's see, maybe I'll come back. Well, let's see what's right for me. It was, his career is over. He did everything he tried to do. He did everything he can, and it's over. There's no more Baker Mayfield in college football. And, I thought that he had a chance to be picked high in the draft. I didn't necessarily think he'd go number 1. I knew that his football career wasn't necessarily over, but it's in some ways when Tim Tebow's career ended, or when, Johnny Manziel's career ended, where it wasn't just about the game being over, the season ending. It's this was a moment in college football when Baker Mayfield was playing, and it's over. And that hunched over look was a feeling of finality that I think was really powerful for me at the time.
So we need to talk about Baker Mayfield, and we may as well do it right here, since we are talking about him as a meme. In this game, he is 23 of 35 for 287 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. He would go on to be the number 1 pick in the NFL draft by the Cleveland Browns. And when I was watching the first half, I was like, yep, that's it. He is in complete control. He is ripping throws. This is the control of it. It's like a point guard. It's okay, he can scoot a little, enough, but he is incredibly accurate, middle of the field, ripping it. And then in the second half, I was like, oh, did the Browns GM not watch the second half of this game before he picked Baker Mayfield over Josh Allen or Sam Darnold or Lamar Jackson? Because it's oh, none of this works anymore. Nobody is open. He airmails a throw to Mark Andrews. That's a pick that sets up a Georgia score. And all of a sudden, it looks very difficult for him against a defense that is good, not great, that is well coached, but is not a defense of the decade kind of thing. And the contrast of that, Shehan, against a really good, they're ranked 6th in the country, I think, coming in statistically, Georgia's defense. I was like, okay, because now, when Baker left Cleveland, I thought, I think he can go on and succeed somewhere. And he kind of hasn't, other than that Monday night game for the Rams. So it's all of Baker Mayfield. It's the entire Baker Mayfield experience wrapped up in one game. But the stark contrast between first half and second half Mayfield is kind of crazy.
Yeah. And, to go back to a coaching moment of the game, one that I very much considered was, I think that Georgia made some pretty significant adjustments at the half. And one of the things that I think they did, and actually this probably gets to a bigger question, but when you look at the way that Georgia's defense was structured back in 2017 versus 2022, this was not a defensive line team. This was not a very good defensive line. I mean, it was good, but we're talking Georgia standards. they were able to create some pressure. They were able to stop the run all right, but they were a unit that got pushed around a little bit by Oklahoma's offensive line, especially in the first half. I think that Oklahoma's running backs started to figure out the predictability of it. And at halftime, it seems like Kirby Smart went into the locker room and said, we need to generate pressure with linebackers. And we saw that with Roquan Smith. We saw that with Lorenzo Styles. We saw that there's another linebacker whose name is escaping me right now. Reggie Carter, I think, was another linebacker who got in there. And they were like, we have this speed advantage and we can come from different angles. We have to confuse Baker. Because when he was being allowed to play against base defensive line pressure, he was carving them up. I believe he had 200 of his 289 yards in the first half. And I think that a lot of that was Georgia started making him question what he was seeing in front of him. And which is something that you see in the NFL all the time, right? The famous Sam Darnold's, I'm seeing ghosts right now sort of thing, right? And I think that Baker did not handle that very well. You started to see him, again, lose that kind of edge that he has as a player, which I think is so vital to how he played at the college level. And I think that's something that he lost in the NFL and never got back as well. Like, he has to have the swagger. He has to have the edge. He has to feel in control. And I think that you saw at the end of the game, he was pressing and he was trying to think too much and he was trying to make the right decision, but didn't necessarily trust himself to do it. And you're right. It was like two completely separate players in the first half versus the second half. And I think a lot of that has to do with what Georgia did with him, but it also certainly should have been a warning sign to be picked number 1 overall in the NFL draft.
He's a see it and rip it guy. Yes. When he diagnoses and feels good about it, he's in control. But a lot of guys, if you second guess yourself, you shuffle your feet in the pocket, well, if you're a great athlete, if you're Patrick Mahomes and then you can throw a behind the back pass, or you're Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen, you can just run. When it gets hairy, you're still okay. When it gets hairy for Baker, it's dead. It's over. So when he's in control and it's boom, read it, rip it, he looks like a Heisman winner first round pick. And when it doesn't, it's over. You mentioned a game-saving moment earlier. There's multiple ones in here. The comparison is so interesting to me. Georgia last year against Ohio State is on the edge of being dead. They're down 11. They're actually down 14. They kick a field goal. They get a stop on Ohio State. But like Ohio State's still in control in the fourth quarter. And Georgia has a one-play 76-yard touchdown drive on a pass to Arian Smith from Stetson Bennett that just is like, it's a one-play touchdown drive. In this game against Oklahoma, Georgia has a one-play 75-yard touchdown drive. It's when they're down 21-7 early and they get the ball with 1 minute into the second quarter, down 2 scores. They hand it off to Sony Michel. There's no linebackers. I think there might be 8 players on the field for Oklahoma's defense. I don't know what happens. And Sony Michel just runs. I don't think he doesn't break a tackle. He just runs through a gigantic hole and runs 75 yards for a touchdown. That idea, Shehan, that Georgia in these moments has these quick strike plays that, and they don't necessarily flip games, but they keep them in games when the game is maybe on the edge of getting away from them. That it happened against Ohio State and it had happened earlier against Oklahoma in this game. I have that as a game-saving moment because I feel like if they go 3 and out there, if they don't get a touchdown, or even if it's not such a quick strike that it's not a shock to the system for Oklahoma, Oklahoma is still in control. We talked about how they controlled the whole first half, but they were in control with Georgia having a 75-yard touchdown. If Georgia didn't have this, they just weren't getting anything done. They could have been down 4 scores going to halftime, and this keeps them in it early when it had a chance to completely get away from them. What other kind of game-saving things did you have in mind?
No, I think that that's huge. Like I mentioned, the sequence at the end of the second half, I think was really, really big for them. And I think and this is part of it, but that Nick Chubb run was, I think, a momentum shifter. Just not in terms of the game itself, but all of a sudden, after that play, this was a Georgia crowd. They were still down, but this was a Georgia crowd after that. Actually, even it's funny on the field goal in the second overtime when Oklahoma was kicking a field goal, you can clearly hear Georgia's fans saying, block that kick. And like, this is a Georgia crowd after this game. This is an Oklahoma, oh no, what's about to happen? I think they had pulled up a stat on the screen that Oklahoma hadn't lost a game in 10 years after leading at halftime by double figures. Well, that was, I think, the moment where it was like, oh, okay, Oklahoma's going to give this to us. They're going to give it back to us right now. And this is going to be a one-score game, and we're going to have control, and we're going to have all the momentum. So I think that just, not just from a score perspective, but from a momentum perspective, that play coming out and changing things, I think, was huge. And certainly the near pick six for Dominic Smith against Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield tries to throw it into a tight window. Like you talk about, he doesn't, he sees the receiver coming off. It's a pretty good decision to make that pass, but he waits maybe a hair too long, doesn't launch it at maybe the angle that he needs to, and he airmails it, and it's almost turned into a pick six. And I think that just did such a huge part of swinging this game. Now Oklahoma got it back, and obviously it ended up going to overtime, but those were plays where it was like, this isn't whether Oklahoma can come out and win this game. This is going to be a game of, can Oklahoma hold off Georgia long enough to complete this game? Because they're not doing anything else.
All right, last break here on the College Football Survivor Show. When we come back, we're going to talk about, did these teams look like championship teams? We'll do that next after this. The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Doug and Shehan back. It's our first version of doing this on the College Football Survivor Show. We go back and rewatch a game. You guys can find it on YouTube. It is the 2017 season, the college football playoff semifinal between Georgia and Oklahoma. Shehan, did you think that Oklahoma looked like a championship team?
So I got to ask a clarifying question for you first. When you ask yourself this question, are you asking, do they look like a championship team in 2017 or in 2022 and 2023?
Both. I think it's one of those, like, do you watch this team and just think generally with what you know about football, yeah, they look like they're good enough to win it all? Or do you look at them and think, oh, no, there's like a fatal flaw there. Like, there's just not enough talent, or they're making too many goofy mistakes. But you're saying you think that is a significant difference between winning one in 2017 and now trying to win one 5 or 6 years later.
I do think so. And I think that 2019 is probably the year when I view that as switching, where I view it as being, they're almost perfect teams, right? 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama, 2021 and 2022 Georgia. I think that these are not fully perfect teams, but really, really, really freaking close to perfect teams. And 2017, the Alabama team that won. Not perfect by any means. 2018, the Clemson team that wins. Really, really good, probably heading towards that, but I don't think they're there as yet. Regardless, I think Oklahoma is a no. I think that they just, like you said, I mean, I hate to rag on it. And, this is something that we heard a lot when Lincoln Riley left from Oklahoma. A lot of Oklahoma fans brought this sort of thing up. And it's hard to sometimes tell what's bitterness versus some truth to it. But you're right. They're not a very detail-oriented team. They really struggle with the little things. And like you talk about, obviously Kenneth Murray was a freshman. It's not really fully on him, but there are these moments where he's just going to the wrong hole. He's not coached the right way to do what he's supposed to do. You see these moments where obviously for Oklahoma's offense, where they are just making bad decisions and they're just making mistakes. And it's just, you can't be so mistake prone in the little ways and expect to win in the big ways. I don't think that this team looked like a championship team in either era.
The defense is rough, man. And it is really hard to wrap your head around. Mike Stoops is the defensive coordinator during this season. He's fired like a month into the next year. Then Ruffin McNeil's the defensive coordinator on the interim for the rest of 2018. They bring in Alex Grinch in 2019. So this is a defense that's already teetering, right? I mean, you fire a defensive coordinator a month into the next season, you have questions about him right now. So he's a leftover. He's Bob Stoops' brother. Lincoln Riley inherits him in year one. What's he going to do? Hey, Lincoln, I'm going to step down. You want the job? yeah, cool, I'm going to fire your brother, though. It's like, what? No, you're not going to fire my brother. So you get why it happened, but that it hasn't been entirely figured out, right? That Ruff McNeil, he's the interim guy. That's Lincoln Riley's mentor. And then he picks Alex Grinch. And here we are with Alex Grinch. It's been 4 years of Alex Grinch and Lincoln Riley, and it's still not good enough. It's almost sad. Like it makes me sad. What if you put Phil Parker's Iowa defense with Lincoln Riley's offense? Right? What if you put, I don't know, pick another good defense? Like it's not that difficult because, again, Okoronkwo is great in this game, right? He's getting pressure, but it's also just like be in the right gap, do your job. If this defense does its job, just stand where you're lined up. Don't move and then catch the guys that run into you. Oklahoma wins. They're running away from tackles during this game. There are 5 rushing touchdowns of 25 yards or more in this game. 1 by Oklahoma, 4 by Georgia. It is big play, big play, big play, big play. Because Jake Fromm and that passing game for Georgia aren't good enough to be consistently moving the ball down the field. Make them work a little bit, Oklahoma. So this is a fatal flaw. And it's what Lincoln Riley's entire career is about. Is the flaw still fatal? Or is it only a deep wound and you can patch it up and win? I don't know. It still feels fatal to me. And that he's not going to get over the top until this gets straightened out. And it might take the $2 million a year completely outside hire to get it done, because it doesn't feel like it's there yet. But this offense is so special, Shehan. But yet I agree, it does not look like a championship team, because I don't know. It's even like 2021 Georgia. Their defense is so good. Will their offense be good enough? The Georgia offense in 21 is significantly better than the Oklahoma defense in 17, right? Like, like what's the worst side of the ball to win a championship in the last X number of years, right? Has there really been a team that's just been really like below average on a whole side of the ball and still got over the top? I just no, that's not how football works.
No, I don't think that there is. And so, no, I mean, and again, it's one thing again that Oklahoma fans tell me that I think is something interesting to look at least, is you could make the argument that Lincoln Riley's best team was the team that he didn't recruit and develop. That it was the 2017 team that was primarily put together by Bob Stoops. I don't think I fully agree, but I don't fully disagree either. And certainly we know that Lincoln Riley can put together 10 and 11 win teams like it's nothing, that he can play for conference championships, that he can win conference championships. He is one of the highest floors of any coach I think that's ever existed in college football. Like, he is really, really, really good. But it's those details. It is, are you lined up exactly, the exact amount of inches away? Are you hitting that right gap? Do you know every bit of your responsibility for this assignment? And it's interesting that you mentioned, right? Because there are shades of this that we've seen, not quite exactly the same thing, but with Ryan Day, and he makes the big coordinator hire in Jim Knowles. And I think that we've seen positive returns, and I expect in 2023 we'll see even more positive returns. Is this a hire thing, or is this a head coach thing? Because one thing that I've also become really interested in, because again, as people know, I was covering Big 12 schools in the mid-2010s. I saw Baylor under Art Briles obviously become what they became, and then obviously Lincoln Riley completely dominate the Big 12 while Charlie Strong really struggled and Gary Patterson lost his way. But I'm sort of starting to wonder now if an offensive coach, and especially an offensive play caller, can kind of do this thing. Or if you kind of, in this era, need a coach who instills that physicality and toughness that typically comes from a defensive coach throughout a roster.
We're going to do another Kirby and Lincoln podcast. Hold that question. That's why we're doing this. You're asking the right questions. Georgia. Is Georgia a championship team? And let me drop you this information. In the last 2 NFL drafts, there have been 12 Georgia defensive players drafted. There have been 7 players drafted in the first round, last 2 drafts. So that's the 2021 Georgia team, the greatest defense we've seen in the modern era, probably. has 7 first-rounders on it and 12 drafted players. This Georgia defense, the top 15 players on this defense in snap counts in this game, 4 got drafted. 4 of the 15. And the only 2 first-rounders were Roquan Smith, who was a top 10 pick after this season, middle linebacker, unbelievable. And then DeAndre Baker, their corner, who's a first-round pick, number 30, the next year. Okay? They have Lorenzo Carter in the 3rd round, the guy who blocked the field goal, and then they have a 5th-rounder. The discrepancy in talent is not close. But yet, I still think they look like a championship team, but also they would get rolled by the last 2 versions of Georgia. But in this moment, and they almost were, it took an Alabama quarterback change to beat this Georgia team because they're so well coached and because this run game is absolutely diabolical. I would say yes to Georgia while acknowledging, well, but not compared to now.
Well, that's the thing, because you have to say yes about Georgia because they should have won the thing, right?
They should have
won the national championship in 2017. I'm curious for your perspective, even when you look around the other teams, like, is 2017 just a disproportionately weak year? Because you have the 1 seed is Clemson with Kelly Bryant, who got pretty wrecked by an Alabama team that was only fine. And then, you have Alabama that year, and this is the year that obviously Jalen Hurts takes over, or no, this is the second year of the Jalen Hurts thing, and he's good, not great, hasn't totally figured himself out, and then they throw in Tua, and it's like, oh, okay, this is what Alabama could be. But they weren't that as yet, and then Georgia's good, but, like, I don't know if they're better necessarily than either of the Clemson teams that sandwiched 2016 and 18. I don't know if they're as good as, 2015 Alabama. Like, maybe they're in that range. I don't know. It's a weird year. I don't necessarily know how to judge this season especially well, because I don't know. Am I off? It feels like it was kind of a relatively weak year.
I think you're right. And that also leads to the question. I mean, when we said that that Oklahoma was a no, if Oklahoma wins this game, do you think they could have beaten Bama?
I think so.
I think they could have.
I think they could have, yeah. I absolutely think so.
On one hand, it's like, well, I'm like, they might have just, what if they just did that version of a first half against Bama, and then Bama, I don't know, doesn't have Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, and, Lincoln Riley learns from his mistakes and doesn't blow it to the same level. I don't know. I think Oklahoma could have won it this year.
Yeah, I think so too. And again, that says more to me about the year than it necessarily does about Oklahoma. But really, now that I think about it, I don't know what I'm thinking. There was a great team that year, and they were national champions. And of course, that is number 6 UCF, went undefeated.
Oh, look at you. Yeah. Well, you just did that. You really did that for real on the playoff show? Should we have Scott Frost on?
Hey, 2017 UCF is a huge part of the reason that we have the playoff now, so that we don't have to hear about stuff like that ever again.
Yeah, that's true. It is. It's just that Bama team, Micah Fitzpatrick's really good on that defense.
Some really good players.
Damian Harris, Bo Scarborough, timeshare at running back with a little Josh Jacobs mixed in. Jerry Jeudy and Devontae Smith and all those receivers are, doing their thing, but like it's not maximum. It's not maximum.
No, they're all young that year too. They're not who they're going to be.
So I think they could have been. Okay. Scale of 1 to 1,000. How would you rate this game as like a fan watching this? What would you give it, fan Shehan?
Oh man, I think that this is like a 1,500. This is one of the best games I think that there's been in the last decade. I think that the fact that it's in the Rose Bowl is huge. The fact that we're getting year 1 Lincoln versus year 2 Kirby. Certainly in hindsight, we have the names that have come out of this game, including a CeeDee Lamb and a Mark Andrews and Baker being the Heisman winner. This felt like, even at the time, and I'm curious again, I covered the Big 12 in 2017, so I knew like what this Oklahoma team was to Oklahoma and to this part of the country. I mean, when I watched this game, it felt like the start of something. And I'm curious if you had that even back in 2017, if you had any of that feeling.
So I was at the Cotton Bowl covering Ohio State USC and trying to figure out if the Browns should draft Sam Darnold instead of Baker Mayfield. So like, I don't remember what I thought about
Well, the good news is they would have been wrong regardless.
Yeah. No, I don't know what bowl game Josh Allen was in, but should have gone to that one. So, yeah, I do think it felt. Let me say this from like that perspective, from like an Ohio State perspective, what Ohio State's trying to be right there. It was such a Bama Clemson sport still, because Bama and Clemson are coming off back-to-back national title matchups, awesome games in 15 and 16. So now we're in 17, and now they're going to play in a semifinal, and Clemson's number 1, and Bama kind of slid in the back door at number 4, and holy moly, that this very much felt like an undercard to me. And it felt like, Georgia, they're the second best team in their own conference, and Oklahoma, they don't play any defense, but Bama, Clemson. And so now like that's why part of this is just for me, that I needed to look at this game in a new light, because as much as this was Baker Mayfield and CeeDee Lamb and Mark Andrews and Roquan Smith and Nick Chubb and great, great players, I didn't in the moment think this is the future of college football. I didn't think these programs are as good as Bama and Clemson. What are we talking about? It really felt like an undercard to me. And so to see the value, I think to see the talent and then to see what the coaches mean now, I think we realize it. I can't claim that I knew it in the moment, that it was the start of something.
No, and certainly it's college football's littered with games like this that ended up meaning absolutely nothing, right? And so I think that hey, guess what? Chris Peterson had a really fun, awesome team that made the 2016 playoff, and that was just a thing that happened, unfortunately, right? So you just you never know with this sort of thing. But no, it was incredibly entertaining. I mean, is it out of line I guess last year we had some really good playoff games, but I feel like this is probably the consensus best playoff game. Is that fair to say?
I mean, unless it's Ohio State, Georgia, unless it comes down to a last second field goal, it's double overtime. Right. And again, the star power in this game is absolutely tremendous. I mean, CJ Stroud, Marvin Harrison Jr., all the Georgia guys, that's a lot of star power too. But I think this is probably the leader. I think this held the belt. And Ohio State, Georgia almost got there, but maybe didn't.
Yeah, I think you could probably throw in the 2016 national title game, the Deshaun Watson throw with seconds left to win it. But that's the range we're talking about with this game. Is we are talking about the best games that have been played. I think that for me, I'm sure I'd make a list and think of 100 more games that I haven't thought of. I think that I've been covering college football since 2013. This is probably a top 10 game I've ever seen. I'd have to think about it, and I might be wrong, but off the top of my head, the combination of game quality, of star power, certainly knowing what these programs became in later years, I think that I guess you have to throw in the national title game in 2017 too for other great games. But I think in the combination of the stakes, what it ended up meaning to college football, it is up there, I think, with the best games that I've seen. But again, if I were to actually write it down, I'd be like, oh wait, I just listed 33 other games.
I love planning podcasts on podcasts. Like if we could rank the 10 best or most entertaining games of the college football playoff era. We certainly could do that. I do for semifinal Alabama, Ohio State in 14 in that mix as well, in terms of what it meant, the quality of the game, the star power of that game. All right, last 3 things here. What did Kirby and Lincoln learn? So let's go Kirby Smart first. What did he learn? I would imagine after what Oklahoma did to this Georgia defense in the first half, and by the way, then the Georgia defense gave up a bunch of points against Ohio State and still found a way to win. It's not like Georgia gets in the playoff and holds teams to 17 points. I would imagine Kirby looked at CeeDee Lamb and Hollywood Brown and Mark Andrews and Rodney Anderson and Baker Mayfield and Lincoln Riley and said, we need better players. We need more talent on defense. And that if he didn't know it, he knew it now. And that this, not that Alabama's not but this is the Big 12's a nice conference to wake you up to this reality. And then, LSU in 2019 and the SEC is a team to wake you up to this reality. But I would bet money, and maybe he's even said it, that you come away from this thinking, okay, we found a way to win, but we can't get steamrolled like that. So we need some more dudes who can run and hit and cover, because they are short here, Shehan. They just are. from a defensive talent standpoint. So I think Kirby would have learned that.
Yeah, and I think the other part of this too, I've mentioned the comparison to first half versus second half, where second half, they really felt like they were trying to get a lot more pressure with linebackers, some defensive back blitzes as well. But you saw in the first half what his vision of what a defense is supposed to look like in his mind, right? Where you have this perfect team defense where we don't have to rush. We don't have to send extra guys. Our defensive line is so good that they're going to handle it with 4, and our defensive backs are going to be perfect, and our linebackers will just fill every gap. And it didn't work at the time because, like you said, they didn't have the personnel outside of probably the linebacker position. Linebacker is probably the one position where I felt like they were there. But defensive line, they were good, not great. Defensive back, they had lapses. Some really good players on this team, but I do think that even the level of rotating that you see now versus what you saw then, there were very few plays where you saw these wild rotations of, a whole group of second team players in on key plays, for example. There was only one really, really key sequence that I remember where I believe Oklahoma had 3rd and 3 in the third quarter and they subbed and Georgia fully switched to their third down, rush defense. But you didn't see that throughout the way that maybe you do now, where Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis are playing 38% of snaps. You didn't see that the same kind of way because I don't think that they had guys to fill up the other 62% of snaps the same way.
I do think that this is fundamental. I think this is why you go out in the world, right? This is why you play non-conference games. And this is why the 12-team playoff is going to be so great, because we're going to get so much more of this, that we're going to get these contrasts of styles between national powers. And so they had never played before. They say that right off the top with Georgia and Oklahoma in the pregame. Never had played before. And
Crazy.
Look what happened when they did. It's so good. So I do think Kirby Smart would take that away. What do you think Lincoln Riley learned from this? Because I do think there's a nice mix of run and pass in this game. Hey, you need a quarterback you can rely on. Well, guess what? He's got Kyler Murray, and then he brings in Jalen Hurts, and then he had Spencer Rattler lined up, and then he had Caleb Williams lined up. And in year one, he had been with Baker. He had developed Baker as the offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach of this team. So he saw how far a great quarterback could take you. So do you think something was reinforced here for Lincoln Riley, or where did he learn of okay, this needs to be better, that you think he's applied?
Well, I think that there's a couple things. First, I don't think he's learned enough, frankly. I think that a lot of these issues are still part of his DNA in some ways. I do think that it did help him double down on how important the run game is. Some of that was just what he inherited at Oklahoma. They had great running backs. They had a great offensive line. So you kind of had to run the ball. I think in 2015 and 16, they had Joe Mixon. They had Samaje Perine, 2 players who were really, really good runners. And again, in 2017, they didn't necessarily have elite running backs. Rodney Anderson had an all-time game, but that wasn't necessarily their thing. I think that this reinforced that he needed that to be a huge part of his offensive identity. They run a lot of counter. That's a base of how they do everything. And so I think that was definitely reinforced just watching the way that this game script played out. And I think that along with that, I think to an extent you saw him move away from true pocket quarterbacks. I think that he started to value, and you probably have to combine this with what happened in 2018 with Kyler Murray taking over. I think he started to realize what a weapon that was to be able to run with your quarterback and how it opened up the game for everything and everyone else. Whereas with Baker Mayfield, you saw individual running plays, but not quarterback run, right? That wasn't part of their game plan. In 2018, you get Kyler Murray. In 2019, you get Jalen Hurts. I think that 2020 and half of 2021 is actually a reinforcement of that, with Spencer Rattler being so much of a pocket passer, but you maybe just bet on the arm talent and it didn't pay off. And then Caleb Williams has been that. I think he's been at his best with a quarterback who can both pass and run at a high level. So those would be the 2 big things. I want him as a selfish viewer of college football, I want him to have learned that the details matter. I want him to have learned that you do need a wide depth of defensive personnel, that offensive skill talent can't be the thing that wins you a national championship. but I don't know if that's the case. Maybe by 2023 he's learned it, because I love the transfer defensive line he's brought in, but like, I don't know, man. It's been a bunch of years, and we've been saying this for 6 years at this point, that things need to change. So when he finally does it, and I think he's not even 40 still. Like, I think maybe he's turning 40 this year. He's still extremely young. We do have to say that, but
he is.
Oh man, how much grief could he have saved himself and everyone else if he had maybe come to some of these realizations that felt pretty glaring after the 2017 college football playoff.
It's interesting because that's obviously Kyler's already there. Kyler's already in the pipeline to be the next quarterback. But then when he gets to Jalen Hurts and he gets to some of these other guys that he chooses to bring in Jalen Hurts, like, again, the stuff we talked about with Baker of like, okay, when it's on time and on target, you're good. But when it gets off schedule, what do? I think that's a really smart point about maybe wanting a little more mobility from the quarterback. We'll end it with this. What if Oklahoma would have won? So I already said, okay, I think Justin Fields is the starting quarterback somewhere in the middle of the 2018 season from Georgia. He never leaves and goes to Ohio State. We think maybe Kirby makes more wholesale changes or gets after it in some offensive ways even earlier because it's not good enough. Let me also say this. I don't want to sell Alabama short. I don't want to end this. Alabama has 8 players drafted in the draft after this April after this season, including 3 first-rounders. Calvin Ridley's also, I'm like, they got some dudes, okay? They have some dudes here. But I think it's possible. I think it's possible Oklahoma could have won the national title. But maybe even if I just get there, Lincoln Riley's still at Oklahoma. Because I think maybe he leaves because he thinks I can't do it here. Because he never did. But they almost did. So if they even win this game and they go in and they stand in for 15 rounds with Alabama and they're right there, is he still the coach at Oklahoma today? Or do they show him a palm tree and a fancy car and a bunch of zeros on a paycheck and he's gone to USC anyway? Or was there restlessness that began by blowing a game you absolutely should have won in your first game as a playoff coach in your first season as a head coach?
No, I mean, I think it's a fair question, and I think it's a fair point that when you look at what Oklahoma is and what people perceive it as now, I think unfairly, it is seen as a place where you can get close but not win at the highest level. And you look at history, that's not been the case. Oklahoma is probably the 3rd greatest program of all time, especially when you talk about the modern era. Like, this is a great, great, great program. And I think that some of the limitations that are to an extent about Lincoln Riley have been ascribed to the program, including, I think, by Lincoln Riley. And I think that if he wins that first year, if he makes a title game and wins a playoff game, and we're not talking about this monkey being on his back of never winning a playoff game, I do think that changes the conversation. I think it also changes the conversation from the perspective of, Georgia immediately after this is the it program in college football. Alabama, of course, is still Alabama, but Georgia starts reeling off top 2 recruiting classes year after year after year, and people believe in his vision. And it's not only that they won this game, but it's the fact that they, again, should have won the national championship game as well if some things don't happen and Alabama doesn't make that switch. So I think that you're looking at a perception gap between these programs. Now, defensive talent would have flocked to Georgia, I think, anyway, maybe not in the same numbers as it did, but there were very few programs that were making the case that, hey, you're going to be a defender and you're going to be the superstar on campus. Like, not many programs have made that pitch. But I do think it changes the way people look at Oklahoma earlier. I think that people start to say, if I'm an offensive player, like, this is it. This is happening. I'm curious. You look at the wide receivers who left the state of Texas to end up at Alabama, or the wide receivers who left the state of Texas to end up at Ohio State down the road. Do they more go to Oklahoma than they already did before? Maybe. I'm curious too. Obviously, we can't really know this answer, how things would have worked defensively if they had been good enough and had a national championship defense. Does Mike Stoops stick around, but maybe the perception isn't so bad, so he's able to recruit differently than he was the next year, and then Alex Grinch was able to? I don't know. I mean, there's so many questions this brings up. And then certainly you have to talk about it from the perspective outside of Lincoln Riley of if Oklahoma views itself as a program that can win the national championship while playing in the Big 12, I don't think they're in as big of a hurry to get to the SEC.
I love it. I love it. This is what we do. One game, one blocked field goal in overtime changes the whole history of Oklahoma as an athletic department.
I think that Oklahoma, and I'll throw Texas into this as well, sees Texas A&M leave for the SEC and be talked about in the way that Texas A&M is talked about, when both of these programs know absolutely freaking sure that they are miles better and miles ahead of Texas A&M in their minds. And it makes them say, well, we'll just get that bump too if we put this logo on our jersey. And to a large extent, I don't think they're wrong, especially Oklahoma. I think that last year, Oklahoma has the number 4 recruiting class in the country. That's better than basically any recruiting class that Lincoln Riley has put together. And the other thing you mentioned about it is that it's much more balanced than any recruiting class that Lincoln Riley put together while he was at Oklahoma. So I don't know. I mean, it's I could ramble about this for a while, but I do think that it changed the way that Lincoln Riley looks at himself. I think that it changed the way that Lincoln Riley looks at this program. I think it changes the way that college football looks at this program. And again, I mean, it's crazy to say that a missed field goal or, a DJ Ward not tackling one freshman on second down changes everything and maybe changes the financial future of college football. But only play 12 of these games a year, man. Every individual one has such a massive individual impact on the way that history goes.
Big 12 hasn't won a national championship since Texas in 2005. Oklahoma won its last national title in 2000. I think it went long enough that they reached the point where they thought, we can't anymore. And they were this close to maybe doing it. Now listen, like we're saying, Deron Payne and Rashaan Evans and Minka Fitzpatrick, the 3 first-rounders on this Alabama defense, and we get it. We're not assuming, but they would have taken their shot, or they at least would have had that moment. Instead, Lincoln Riley's never won a playoff game. So that's where we are. This was long. It will be our one podcast this week. It's summer. We're taking a little time for ourselves, so we will have one podcast this week, and the plan is to have one the following week, and then also perhaps only one the following week. We're normally doing 2 free ones a week now, as you guys know. But the next one, our plan, unless there's gigantic news in college football, is to sort of break down college football into Kirbys and Lincolns. Who's a Kirby, who's a Lincoln, and who will have the edge going forward in college football. So before we did that, we had to go into the past. So we hope you guys enjoyed that. We hope you learned something about what's happening right now in college football. And again, if you want to go back and watch it, sometimes it's just fun to watch whole games. Sometimes it's just fun to watch any good football game. This was a really interesting, fun football game. So we appreciate you guys making us part of your college football fandom. For Shehan Jeyarajah of CBSSports.com, I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was the College Football Survivor Show. The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.